links before you visit them. You can also report on the app, and there are passive ways that you can protect yourself as well. So you can turn on message filtering or have your calls automatically blocked if they are blacklisted. So if you were to go through the check flow here, so this is how the home screen looks like. You can click through. Maybe you want to check a message that you got on WhatsApp, and you can upload a screenshot, and after submitting it and checking, you can see one of the following screens. It could be a red scam screen. So this could be a variety of reasons, right? Maybe the message that is captured is very similar to a scam message that we've seen before. Maybe the sender was blacklisted and has been making scammy calls or sending scammy messages. Or maybe even the link inside has been determined to be malicious or phishing link. So that's when we tell you that, be careful before you decide to interact with this. There are other things we can tell you as well, like whether it looks like spam, or maybe there's just not enough information in the screenshot or what you sent to us. Or maybe it could be safe if it's one of the sender IDs registered with IMDA. Okay, so that's just a quick overview of what ScamShield does. And here now I want to, before I start talking about backend driven UI, I want to talk a bit about some of the issues that we face while developing on mobile that made us consider it in the first place. So how many of you here have experience working on mobile apps? Okay, so it looks like 1/3 or 1/4 of you. So for those that have experience, I'm sure you're quite familiar that updates are really slow. So if you were to submit an Android store review, it could take maybe a few hours if you're lucky, but some people have reported it taking up to 10 days for the Google Play Store to say, okay, you can start releasing your app. iOS is a bit better. They have gotten faster over the years. So now most apps get reviewed in a day, but it still takes time. And if you're making mobile releases, it's good practice to do it over a week. So maybe Monday, you release it to 1% of your user base. Tuesday, 2%, 5%, 10%. And then by Sunday, you'll get it to 100% of your user base. And also many users don't have automatic updates turned on. So what does this mean for us? It means that when you have a fix or feature that you've merged and tested already, it can take days or even weeks for users to receive this change. So that's quite a big issue if you have an urgent fix to release, right? Furthermore, updates are not guaranteed. So when you release an update onto the store, there may be a period of time where many users are still lingering on older versions. So since we're using React Native, we use this thing called EAS update. So this is an alternative to Microsoft Code Push, if any of you are familiar, but has been deprecated now already. But so what this means is that you're able to swap out your JS bundles and some assets so that users are able to update your app without actually going to the App Store and having to click update. But even with this, we still find that updates are still not guaranteed. There are still users lingering on older versions. So if you take a quick look at our sessions on Datadog recently, in the past 2 weeks, there was still about 7% of iOS users and 2% of Android users still on older versions. And even anecdotally, even after enhancing the app last year, we still have the occasional user coming up to us and saying like, help, we have issues with our app. But when we see the screenshot that they sent us, that was from the version that was uploaded and submitted like 2 years ago. So it can get quite ridiculous sometimes. And why is this a problem for us? So when we work in the scam space, trends come and go really quickly. Scammers take advantage of exploits very fast. And so updates being slow and not guaranteed are an issue because we can't react to it. So imagine you're trying to work on ScamShield and suddenly overnight someone takes advantage of a big exploit that you want to get out to your users. Not only will it take like a week for your users to have it, but half of your users are still on last month's version. So these issues make it difficult for us to react to trends. And so I want to give you a quick example of an exploit that happened recently. So this is a Telegram message, right? It's shortened, but it says collect $2,000 from mof.gov.sg. Looks legit enough, right? But when you try clicking on Telegram, they give you this warning modal that actually the link does not go to mof.gov.sg, scam.com. It's just they embed the link inside, like you can say hello and then that clicks to a link. At least Telegram warns you, but many of the older folk don't really read and see and understand what is going on, especially when you have those forwarded Telegram messages where it's a big redeem, claim your voucher, and it looks exactly like the ones that they send on legitimate government channels. So they might just click into it. However, if you try and copy paste this message or try and screenshot and check it on ScamShield, before we were just telling users that it was safe. Because if you submit off a screenshot, this looks legit, right? It just looks like a legit government link. So this is one of the exploits that happened recently, and I will be briefly talking about how having backend-driven UI helped tackle that a bit. So now let's talk about this backend driven UI. So who here has heard of what backend driven UI is before? Oh, nice. There are some hands. Okay. So it goes under a few different names like API as UI or server driven UI. But basically what it means is that your backend is involved in making UI decisions. So usually it's through some instructions that your backend sends your front end. And as I will share later, this gave us flexibility to tackle the exploit that I was talking about. So this is what I like to call level one. So this is a typical like backend client server infrastructure where your client will make a request to the backend, and then your backend will send some data to the client, and your client will take that data and does whatever it does and render some UI. So if I were to give you an example, so the example of our check outcome screen on the right-hand side, so the left-hand side might look like a typical API response, right? You can see, a classification category of scam. So the front end will take that scam. It will, okay, now I have scam, I'll give you a red screen, a shield icon, give you the copy, beware, this looks like scam. And then, with some of the data report count 89, you just get a number, but it renders out, it's a bit small, but it renders out the copy for you that says reported by you and 89 others. So this is something I'm sure many of you are familiar with. However, what if you want to change your copy easily? So usually in these kinds of situations, you'll have your copy hard-coded on the front end. Maybe you have some internationalization, but still it's a bit difficult to change your copy without making updates to your app. So what if you want to make changes without updating your app? You can start sending the copy from the backend instead. So what that simply means is that instead of just sending data, you send the whole full copy to your front end. So if you see at the green box here, there's a title, likely a job scam. And this is exactly what is rendered here on the screen. Previously, they were just giving you 89, but now they just give you the title to render. So reported by you and 89 others. So you can tell that the front end is slowly becoming more and more dumb and thin, while the backend gives instructions on what to render on the UI. So what's the next step? So you see here, there's an icon, and we render an enum called AI icon. So from this, you should be able to tell that the client will need to understand what this enum means and route it to a corresponding asset that is stored on the front end. So maybe this is like some sparkly icon that a lot of people like use for AI, right? So that means the assets have to be pre-bundled with your mobile app when you upload it. So, but what if you want to change it on the fly, What if you want to make it a pink sparkly icon instead? You can start pushing your assets from the backend as well. So instead of it being an enum that's routed from the front end, you can start passing it an URL, a SVG, a PNG that's directly rendered from the front end, or maybe even a base 64 encoded image. So this is the things you could do. But let's say I want more, I want even more flexibility. The backend can send everything. So now I want to go from like arbitrary examples to like what people do in the industry. So Airbnb actually has this, and they call it server-driven UI. They call it the Ghost platform because it's for like their guests and hosts, I guess. Okay, I realize that it's really small now, but I'll just read out what it says. So it says here, section component type toolbar. So simply from toolbar, the front end is able to tell that this is the style of the component I want to render. From here, it says there are images, so it's a URL on the assets that it renders. There's a title here showing that it brings copy from the backend to the front end. And here there's even an on-click action, which shows that the backend is telling the front end what kind of instructions I want you to do when I press a button. So the reason Airbnb started adopting this is they realized that there are a lot of issues trying to push features across iOS, Android, and web at the same time and trying to have feature parity and look consistent and have the same functionality. Another example is Spotify. So they call this component-driven UI. So there's a lot of different terms for it in the industry. But basically what they're trying to say is that you can reuse components on the front end. And as React developers, we should have heard this before, UI is a function of state. But state can actually be represented by the backend with JSON. And now we can push the JSON from the backend. And now by changing the backend response, you can change what your UI renders, and you can quickly iterate. So this is a similar screen grab to previously where they just push copy from the backend and now it's updated immediately on the front end. So after these examples and levels, ScamShield is about level 2, in between level 2 and 3. We mostly send data and copy, but there are some instances where we do take advantage of sending logic and style as well. So this is an example from the previous screen. We just send some copy over. So now talking about backend-driven UI, I want to link it back to the Telegram exploit that I was talking about earlier, which is this. So after thinking about it with our designers, we decided that how we would tackle it is by introducing new copy so that when users check the link, there will be a warning telling them about what, like, to be careful. So when you click on the learn why, you'll see a modal explaining the exploit, what it does, and to be careful of it. So this is all dandy, right? We introduce a new info box attribute in the backend response, and the new clients are able to interpret that and then show this new nice info box. But the whole point of backend driven UI is to give us flexibility on older clients, right? So what we did instead is actually take advantage of the fact that we already had a reasons array that we were passing and simply just introduce another object so that we are able to warn users on older clients that you have to be careful of link checks when you are working with Telegram. So while this is not perfect and definitely a step down from this, it's infinitely better than not warning users at all, because otherwise it would just give them a false negative. So this is how having backend driven UI has given us some flexibility. So now talking about this, some of you might be wondering, like, this is pretty cool, but should you be using it? And of course, with most new technologies and concepts, it really depends on your use case. So when might this be useful to you? So just like Airbnb, you want feature parity across multiple platforms. You want to release things on iOS, Android, web, even desktop at the same time. Maybe you want consistent branding. Or maybe you're not using React Native, so you don't have access to things like EAS update or Microsoft Code Push to quickly swap out your JS bundle. So you want to make changes, but you can't do it, but you don't want to do it by going through the store. You are maybe in a domain that changes rapidly. So maybe you're also working in the scam space and you need to quickly react to scam trends or exploits. Or maybe you're just like Spotify and you want to iterate quickly. These are possible reasons that you might consider adopting this to help increase your rate of iteration. Or finally, accuracy is critical. So for ScamShield, it's really bad when we show a false negative, because that's what could possibly change a user from being just a user to a potential victim. So that's why accuracy is really important for us as well. So given all these, maybe like one of these applies to you, you might think to yourself, okay, so let's do it. Let's do BDUI, backend driven. What do I have to be careful of? So there's a few things, but I think one big one is that the lines between your backend and front end blur. So how many of you here are like a full stack dev? And how many of you are, okay, I see. How many of you are like purely front end? Okay, any backend devs here? Oh, okay, a fair split. Okay, I see quite a few. Yeah, but so why I'm asking is because if your teams work in separate silos, you have different backend and front-end teams, it might be difficult to introduce this, because obviously a lot of backend only developers don't like working on the front end, and you have to start making, the backend team has to start being a lot more conscious about UI related decisions. So they may have to get involved when the copy has to change, when the style has to change, when the layout of the screen has to change. You might have to ask a backend dev to start centering a div, right? So that might be quite difficult. There's also more upfront cost in ensuring that your front end is also able to handle the various options that your backend is trying to send it. Let's say you have 5 different buttons that your backend is prepared to send. Your front end has to be ready from the get-go to accept all of that and interpret it correctly. Secondly, is also managing validation errors. So I'm sure many of you use TypeScript. Who here uses Zod? Okay, so Zod is a validation library that ensures that, the object that you have conforms to the schema that you expect. So mostly this is used when your client is making an API request and you actually want to be sure that the response you are getting conforms to that shape instead of just typing it and assuming it's correct. However, that could lead to some issues when you're doing this. So let's say I have an API response and I want to validate it with Zod. So there's a reasons icon here that conforms to an enum that I expect. So it maybe at first I'm aware of 2 possible enums, AI icon and read user icon. And these are the only things that I have and launched with. However, as I'm working, I realize I want to release a new feature. I want to have a check icon instead. So what do? I introduce it in the backend, but I also introduce it to the enum on the front end so that it can handle it, right? But when you make that release, you'll find that new clients are fine. They can see, they know the new thing, and they can show the check icon. But if you don't handle it properly on older clients, boom, best case scenario, your screen doesn't render. Worst case, your app crashes. So that's something that you have to be careful, because like I said at the start, updates are slow. If you don't prepare for this at the start, you'll have 50% of your users like with a blank screen and nothing you can do until you decide to roll back your backend change. So how do you handle that? One is API versioning. Your client just says, I'm version 1, and give me the stuff that I can handle. So if you tell it, I'm version 1, the new client will still get the check icon, but the backend is smart enough to know that the client can't handle the check icon and gives it a sensible default, maybe the AI icon or maybe even undefined so that it doesn't show anything. Another way to handle is just make your client forward compatible. So this is a very quick code snippet that I realize now is also very small, but the gist of it is just to validate safely. And then if it doesn't pass, you just log so you can track it next time, but default to a sensible default. So for example, in this case, AI icon as well. So that even though the backend sends a response with check icon, your new client will be able to handle it, but your old client will default to something safe that it can understand and does not crash on you. So that brings me to the end of my talk. In conclusion, backend-driven UI is where your backend makes some UI decisions. We use it to give us flexibility in a very rapidly changing domain there where accuracy is important. But it's not a silver bullet, and you really need to consider when you want to use it because that increases the complexity of your project. So that's all from me today. Would love any questions or anyone who has personal experiences with backend-driven UI that they would like to share. Thank you.
Hey Rayner, thanks for the presentation. One question I have is how do you deal with like increasing attack surface with this backend driven UI? Because attacker can just maybe uh, try to mock the response from backend on the application side and try to gain access to privilege JavaScript functions in the app. So my question is rather, how do you tackle the security vulnerability aspect that comes with backend driven UI?
Okay, so if I'm understanding you correctly, it's because all the logic is held in the front end. When you are able to manipulate the backend response, you can change what the front end decides to do. And that might leak some kind of information that you don't want them to see, right? Is that correct? Yeah. I think how I would approach that is that when you are building front end and you're building clients, you would generally have the understanding that it's public and accessible. When you visit a website, you can right click and inspect the source and see the JavaScript. The same thing with a mobile app. When you download a mobile app, anyone can decompile your app and see everything that goes under the hood. So you would start with the perspective of understanding that everything in your client is vulnerable and compromised. So anything that is sensitive, you typically hold on the back end. Does that answer your question?
Sorry, for example, like let's say you have a function, but it's very privileged. Like you need to enter the password to go inside inside the app. Now the attacker can, let's say you're making the authentication page using backend driven UI.
Mm-hmm.
Now the backend response just allows you to bypass the authentication with whatever input. I'm giving a very easy example, but things like this can be very possible with backend driven UI, right?
I would say that it's not just specific to backend driven UI where this is possible. Like in the same way that you can decompile an app, I'm also able to, like if I'm a sophisticated enough hacker, I can download the app and I can just jump through all your pages without needing to log in. I would not have to bypass it by spoofing some kind of backend in order to access the privileged pages. Yeah. So once again, I think like the pages itself shouldn't be privileged. It's more so the data that's accessed, and then that's related to how you manage authentication and authorization in your API requests. I hope that's clear. Thank you. Any more questions? Sorry, there's
Hi.
someone. We'll get back to you.
Thank you for the sharing. So one of my question is because now we are moving more of the responsibility to the back end, right? How much in terms of compute resources on the back end will increase? Because, for example, in React, most of the document tree and everything is handled there. But if we move more to the back end, will it impact the back end compute resources a lot?
I think it very much depends on the scale. So at least for us at ScamShield, the app is relatively lean. So by pushing some of these, like imagine let's say the simple example of copy, right? it's trivial to render the copy on the backend and send it in your JSON as opposed to letting your front end render it. Similar to a lot of the, I guess the most heavy one would be assets if you decide to base 64 and code it. But I would say it really depends on the scale of your app and the size of your infrastructure. Yeah, but I think in most cases, you would not, it would not be too performance heavy. I think if you find that you are having latency issues like per request and you find that one page, you're trying to fetch a lot of pages at once and it's taking a long time, I think the most like tried and tested strategy for many front ends is to do chunking, right? Or lazy loading. So you only fetch the relevant pages or screens that the user is looking at any time. And maybe by doing that, you're able to modularize like the amount of compute that happens at once. And by that, you ensure that the latency doesn't jump too high when the user is looking at something. And as they scroll around and you move to different parts, then that's where you start loading more things. So I think that's how you can keep the performance on both the front end and the back end quite light. Yeah. But I would say it really depends on how you structure your app. We have a question here too. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, I'm quite curious about assets in the backend because I always thought that we usually at least I'm not familiar with mobile app development, but in web app development you wouldn't constantly fetch heavy resources like maybe images from the backend because cloud egress costs, etc. So I was just curious, are there a lot of cases where people actually put the assets in the backend for the client to render, or is it mostly, or do we still leave the assets in the client or maybe in S3, etc.?
I think it depends. So when you say assets, right, do you mean an asset passed from the backend like in the form of a URL or in the form of like encoding in base 64?
I think maybe like in a literal image.
Sorry?
Like a literal, like the actual image
Oh,
itself.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think so I guess it's this base 64. I don't think that's ideal at all. I don't think many people use it. So if you go to back to the examples of how Airbnb and Spotify does it, you can see that the way that they pass, I know you can't see it, but it's really small, trust me. But the image is just a URL. So I imagine that you have your assets stored in S3 or any kind of image hosting bucket, and then simply you will just pass like the relevant strings to the front end, and your front end will just pull it from the bucket as well.
Oh, I see. Wouldn't that possibly incur costs?
Definitely, but S3 costs are relatively cheap.
I see, I see.
But I mean, it's really flexible. Like if you find that the costs don't work for you, you don't have to shift your assets to the back end. You can always decide to leave your assets on the front end. Yeah, the thing about this is that you don't have to incrementally like take everything. You can like choose which ones are relevant. That's why I say it's not like a silver bullet you just apply to everything. You use it on like a per need basis and find that if it gives you the value, by being aware of the trade-offs, then you try and adopt it. Yeah. Welcome. Sorry, there's a question at the back there. Oh. We'll get back to you.
Actually, from now, my experience, so if you receive a telephone call, then to key in the telephone number to check whether this is a spam call or not. I just wondering, do you have a way how to, when the call come in, you can simultaneously to show this is scam call or any like a message? So it means you do not have to go back to your app to check. Yeah.
So what I'm hearing is that you're asking about the ScamShield functionality, right? So instead of when you receive a call, then you copy, then you check it on the app, you actually are able to block it directly. So the reason why we decided to build ScamShield as a native app instead of a web app is actually precisely to do what you have been asking about, which is to block calls directly. So we tap into native APIs that look up our database when you receive a call to block calls at the point of receiving the calls. So you don't even see that it reaches your phone. Yeah.
Right. That's good. Okay, cool. I think we
I think
ran
there's
out.
one more question. We can do it. Do we have time for it?
I think let's just
No worries. We can talk
note
about
down
it
your
later.
questions, and then after the second talk, we can discuss, and you can always come to Rayner after the talk. So that we can proceed with the section.
Okay. Thank you so much. I hope you guys have learned something from this.